The bathroom door locked itself again. I didn't even have to touch the handle for the bolt to slide into place with a heavy metallic thud that echoed against the tile walls. It was as if something on the other side of the wood was physically holding it shut or pushing it tight. I sat on the edge of my cot and stared at the door. My classmates were laughing in the main area of the dormitory, their voices muffled by the heavy wood and the distance between rooms. We were in the treat house in the mountains of Bukidnon, a place where the trees grew so thick they seemed to swallow the sunlight by mid-afternoon. I had been there for 3 days with my classmates, trying to find some peace before finals. Instead, I found something that stayed with me long after we left. The bathroom was small and smelled of old stone and dampness. It was a shared space for the 4 students in our wing. When I tried the handle again, it wouldn't budge. It felt deliberate. It didn't feel like a broken mechanism. It felt like a choice made by something inside. I stayed awake that night. The room was silent except for the sound of my own breathing and the occasional rustle of the wind against the window frame. I drifted into a sleep that felt heavy and thick, like sinking into deep water. In the dream, everything was white and sterile. The air tasted like bleach and copper. I was standing in a hallway that stretched on forever, and at the end of it sat a room with a single bed. A woman lay there. She was wearing a thin hospital gown that hung off one shoulder. Her wrists were bound to the metal rails of the bed with thick, fraying ropes. She didn't move when I approached her. Her eyes were closed, and her skin looked like gray parchment stretched over bone. I walked toward her, my footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. When I reached the bed, she opened her eyes. They weren't human eyes. They were wide and vacant, filled with a frantic, desperate energy that made me want to recoil. She didn't speak, but I could feel her thoughts pressing against my brain like a physical weight. She wanted me to see her. She wanted me to know what had happened to her. The scene shifted suddenly. The hospital room dissolved into the bathroom of the retreat house. The transition was violent and jarring. The woman was still there, but she was no longer on a bed. She was standing in the corner of the small bathroom, clutching a heavy, tattered blanket. She moved with a strange, jerky motion, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I watched her wrap the fabric around her neck and loop it over the high metal pipe above the shower head. She stepped off her feet. The sound of the rope snapping against the pipe was loud as a gunshot in my ears. I woke up gasping for air. My chest felt tight, and my skin was slick with sweat. I sat up in my bunk and looked toward the door of the bathroom. It was still there, silent and imposing in the dark. I told myself it was just a nightmare brought on by the isolation and the heavy atmosphere of the mountains. The next morning, the sun struggled to pierce through the thick canopy of trees outside. My classmates were getting ready for breakfast. I walked toward the bathroom to wash my face. Before I could reach for the handle, the lock clicked into place again. The sound was unmistakable. It was the same heavy thud from the night before. I stood there for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. Something was wrong. I called out for Maya, who lived in the room next to mine, but she was already at the dining hall with the others. I tried the handle again, twisting it back and forth. It stayed firm. I didn't want to make a scene. I just wanted to wash my face. I leaned my forehead against the wood and whispered for whoever or whatever was inside to let me in. There was no response, only the sound of my own pulse in my ears. Then I heard it, a soft, wet, sliding sound. It sounded like something heavy and damp being dragged across the floor just inches away from the door. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still until the sound stopped. I gathered my courage and gripped the handle with both hands, pulling as hard as I could. The lock didn't give way at first, but then it groaned. It felt like something on the other side was pushing back against me with immense strength. With a sudden crack, the mechanism gave way and the door swung inward. The air that hit my face smelled of rot and stagnant water. I stepped inside, my legs feeling heavy and uncoordinated. The room was small, and the light from the hallway hit the tiles in sharp angles. I didn't look toward the back of the room first. I looked at the floor. That is when I saw the feet. They were hanging in midair, swaying slightly as if caught in a draft. They were pale, almost blue, and covered in grayish grime. They hung just inches above the floor tiles. I followed the line of the legs upward. The woman from my dream was there. She wasn't on a bed anymore. She was suspended from the ceiling beam near the back window. The blanket was wrapped tightly around her neck, and it had turned a dark, brownish color where it met her skin. Her face was swollen and blackened by the decay of time, yet she looked as if she were present in that very moment. Her eyes were wide open, staring directly at me, their pupils blown out until they were nothing but black voids. The most terrifying part was her mouth. It was hanging open, and a gray, withered tongue protruded from between her blackened lips. It stayed there, frozen in a permanent silent scream. She wasn't just a memory or a dream. She was there, trapped in the space between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. I tried to scream, but my throat seized up. My lungs refused to take in air. The sight of her face, the way her eyes seemed to track my movement even as she hung motionless, was too much for my brain to process. The room began to spin. The walls seemed to pulse like a beating heart. I collapsed to my knees, the back of my head hitting the tiled floor with a dull thud. Everything went black. I didn't feel her move toward me. I didn't hear the sound of her feet hitting the ground. I just felt the world disappear. When I woke up, everything was loud. There were voices shouting my name and the sound of wood splintering. I was lying on my back on the floor, my head throbbing. My classmates were crowded around me, their faces pale with shock. Maya was kneeling beside me, her hands shaking as she held a wet cloth to my forehead. "What happened?" They were asking in hushed, frantic tones. "What did you see?" I couldn't tell them the truth. I couldn't explain how I knew about the woman or why the door had locked itself. I could only point toward the bathroom, and they looked inside. The room was empty. There was no woman hanging from the ceiling. There was no blanket. There was just a small, damp room with an old shower and a cracked mirror. The only thing left behind was the smell of rot that lingered in the air for hours after we were forced to leave that night. The local authorities told us later that the building had been abandoned for years. They found records of a woman who had lived there alone, eventually taking her own life in that very room during a period of severe illness. They said the door was old and often stuck due to the humidity of the mountains. But they didn't know about the dreams. They didn't know about the way the lock clicked twice in one day. And they certainly didn't know why, when I looked into the mirror after we left, I could still see a faint, dark smudge on my own neck where the rope might have touched if she had reached out to grab me. If the door only locks for someone who is being invited in, who was it that opened the door for her in my mind?